stream and the recording, let me know. Oh, there we go. All right, and let me know when you start the recording. Okay. Mario, did you want to come? I see you're here. Did you want to come on to say a few words before we get started?
No, I'll say something at the end.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. When early start the recording when you're ready. Good evening. On behalf of the Brooklyn, Long Island alumni chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated, I welcome you all to this latest installment of the Cast Your Vote Real Talk series, Project 2025 and the Kamala Harris Effect. My name is Kevin Boston Hill, and I will be your moderator for the evening. Project 2025, also known as the 2025 Presidential Transition Project, is an initiative coordinated by the Heritage Foundation that aims to promote conservative and right-wing policies to reshape the United States federal government and consolidate executive power should Donald Trump win the 2024 presidential election. The project asserts that the entire executive branch is under the direct control of the president, under the controversial unitary executive theory. It proposes reclassifying tens of thousands of federal service workers as political appointees in order to replace them with people loyal to the president. Proponents argue it would dismantle what they view as a vast, unaccountable, and liberal government bureaucracy. The project seeks to infuse the government and society with conservative Christian values. Critics have characterized Project 2025 as an authoritarian, Christian nationalist plan to steer the U.S. toward autocracy. Legal experts have said it would undermine the rule of law, separation of powers, separation of church and state, and civil liberties. Tonight, our esteemed panelists will discuss the ramifications of Project 2025 and answer some of your questions. But before we get to those questions, let's learn a little about our panel. Edu Hermelin, with over 20 years of experience working in the New York State Legislature and New York City Council, Edu brings a wealth of knowledge to Mercury. He began his career in government under the leadership of former New York State Assembly member Aurelia Green, who was then the chair of the Assembly Committee on Banks. He has also served in a number of managerial positions for multiple New York elected officials. As an educator and entrepreneur, Edu was previously an educational and political consultant, where he conducted workshops with New York City Department of Education administrators, parents, and students regarding civic and parental engagements, college and career readiness, and financial literacy. He is currently a state Democratic Committee member and district leader in Brooklyn, and also a member of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. Jason Richburg. A native of Long Island, Jason Andrew Richburg currently serves as Suffolk County Legislator for the 15th Legislative District. Richburg's government are rich with experience, starting in 2010 when he created Gregory's Youth Leadership Caucus to mentor young adults from the community who volunteer their time on local service projects. He formalized the internship program in 2015, creating what is now known as the PAGE program, an intensive 12-week summer program which provides a select group of college-age students with firsthand experience in government through participation in a mock legislature. Richburg has served as a member of the NAACP, the Urban League of Young Professionals, the Concerned Fathers of Wheatley Heights, 100 Black Men of Long Island, and is currently the president of the Nassau-Suffolk Alumni Chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. Zakiya Ali. As an educator, Zakiya Ali is a dynamic educational consultant who develops and trains school district leaders, universities, and community-based organizations to help them effectively address race, diversity, and inclusion and equity disparities in the classroom. Zakia also founded Rebuilding Timbuktu Incorporated, a virtual intergenerational reading group whose goal is to encourage readers, educators, and families to incorporate Black authors and texts into their reading, research, and curriculum. Recently, she was a 2021 Essence Festival panelist for the Impact Panel sponsored by Disney, ESPN, and the Undefeated's Kelly Evans Show. Zakia is also principal and founder of Zakia Ali Educational Consulting, LLC, and proud member of Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated. Dr. Kimberly Hardy. Dr. Kimberly Hardy is a member of Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated and the second vice chair of the North Carolina Democratic Party, making her the second highest ranking Black woman in North Carolina politics. In her role with the state party, Dr. Hardy focuses on ensuring that the voices of marginalized communities and the people who live in them, especially African Americans, are heard by elected officials and candidates seeking to represent them. She is currently an associate professor of social work at Fayetteville State University, an HBCU in the University of North Carolina system, but will be joining the faculty at the University of the District of Columbia, where she will help to create a new Master of Social Work program that includes a specialization on political social work, the only HBCU in the country with that focus. Dr. Michael Sharp. Michael Orlando Sharp is a professor of political science at York College and professor of political science and international migration studies at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, as well as adjunct research scholar at Columbia University's Weatherhead East Asian Institute. Dr. Sharp's area of expertise are comparative politics and international relations, and his research interests concern the politics of migration, immigrant political incorporation, and political transnationalism in the Dutch Kingdom, Japan, and around the world. His books and manuscripts include Post-Colonial Citizens and Ethnic Migration, the Netherlands and Japan in the Age of Globalization, and The Politics of Racism and Anti-Racism in Japan. His other research concerns include the politics of remigration, or the paid voluntary return of migrants and their families, pay-to-go schemes, and implicit boundary making in liberal democracies. He is also very intrigued by the intersections of the politics of migration and racism around the world, and a board member of the United Nations affiliated non-governmental organization, International Movement Against All Forms of Discrimination and Racism. So as we welcome all of our panelists, and we do have a few more who will be joining us shortly, I do wish to remind our viewers to please post your questions in the chat if you are here on Zoom, or in the comments section of Facebook and YouTube, if for those who are viewing on those platforms. So now that we have everyone here and we know what the topic is, let's get right on into our questions. And of course, as the questions come out, feel free to jump in on any of the questions that you feel strongly that you would wish to respond to. Project 2025 envisions widespread changes to economic and social policies in the federal government and its agencies. How do you feel Project 2025 would impact both national and international communities? And anyone can start.
I guess I can jump in to start. I mean, I think the dismantling of civil service and civil service guidelines is a huge issue, especially for African Americans or Black Americans or people of color in our country, because it's one of our ways of social progression. You know, getting positions in local government or state government or city government has helped families transition to the middle class. And so I think creating a precedent where you can get rid of that, and those employees will now be fully able to be hired or fired depending on who the executive is a huge issue. You know, we could also talk about, you know, the things that with the getting rid of the abortion rights, because it's not just about abortion, right? It's also about, you know, those folks who have fertility issues, those folks who are getting stem cell research, Part of Project 2025 will also defund certain scientific research programs. You know, those programs that help for cancer research and many other things. So I think in total, I think we all need to be engaged, because while you mentioned a handful of things that Project 2025 does, there's a whole host more that will cataclysmically change how the United States operates going forward.
I I I I agree with everything that Jason has stated earlier. Look, we're looking at the old adage, am I correct? Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Stated by George Santana in 1905 in Life of Reason. Look, the Project 2025 initiative will have a ripple effect on everything that we've fought for the past over 60 years, right? When we're talking about the voting rights of 1964, when we're talking about opportunity programs for children and families from underprivileged communities, those opportunities will be removed. We have to talk about the overall effect on the economy. We're already struggling with economic opportunity, especially as it pertains to MWBEs getting these opportunities and contracts from federal, state, and local municipalities. So again, it's going to have a ripple effect on everywhere, nationally and internationally. As a child of immigrants, you know, most of our family come here to make sure that we can have a better living, right? And for our families living abroad, we send remittance to make sure that they're taken care of as well. So that's a ripple effect on every person's life here in the United States and also abroad.
Before you all have I know you all want to jump in on this question, but before you do, we were just joined by another of our panelists, and I would like to introduce her as well before we get to, and I see, Zakia, I see your hand is raised, but I just want to introduce Lori Daniel Favors. Lori Daniel Favors, as Esquire, serves as Executive Director at the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College. She is an author, activist, and attorney with a long-standing commitment to racial and social justice. Ms. Daniel Favors earned her JD from New York University, where she was a Root Tilden Kern Public Interest Scholar. She graduated from Pennsylvania State University with a BA in African American Studies with a minor in Spanish language. She hosts the Lori Daniel Favors Show on Sirius XM's Urban View Network, a national daily talk show that tackles issues of race, gender, culture, politics, and the law. She is an active member of the North Jersey alumni chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. So welcome, Ms. Daniel Favors. I know, like I said, I think, Zakia, you have your hand raised, so I'll actually go to you, and then we'll jump in with everyone else.
So good evening, everybody. I'm real happy to be here. It's Black August. Woo, woo. I love this month and I love this season. It's a lot of historical events that took place during the month of August. So I feel like that I'm walking in that energy right now, the Black August energy. And in regard to the question, Project 2025 envisions widespread changes. I don't think that 2025 is anything different. I feel like that it just has a new title, and the title is Project 2025, but we could also call it Project 1909. We could also be calling it Project 1865. We could also be calling it Project 1619, because when we think about what's actually written inside of this document, it is the stripping down and the ripping apart and ripping away of the humanity of the people, of other people in this country besides white, male, Christian individuals, and is given voice and is given credence to that population of men who feel like that they are the only ones who deserve to talk. They feel like that they are the only ones who deserve civil rights. They feel like that they are the only ones who deserve social justice. And so we could be living in any given point in time under Project 2025. So we already know that Project 2025 will have a huge impact nationally, because again, it's going to determine and dictate who this society feels is the permanent underclass. But internationally, you'll also see countries starting to or continuing to follow the path of the United States, because they feel that that is the way that you get ahead. So when we think about Kenya, going into Haiti and training and bringing their military forces into Haiti so that they can train them the way that they want them to be trained. And when we think about a country like the Gambia actually striking down the fact that they want to continue to do female mutilation on the genitalia of the girls inside of the country, we see a lot of these countries are just holding on to a continuum of what they think is the recipe to get ahead. So Project 2025 is nothing more than what we've always been doing. So I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, when are we going to get tired of Jim Crow in the United States of America as much as we get tired of anything else in this country? When are we going to get tired of living under this Jim Crow apartheid state that we live in the United States that Project 2025 is underscoring?
Michael and then Kimberly.
Yes, I'd like, and thank you very much. I'd like to chime in on and echo some of the points raised by Zakia on the international effects of this. So Project 2025 has something called the mandate for leadership. And what it threatens to do is actually undermine the whole liberal rules-based international system. That means the refugee system, the asylum system around the world, human rights could all be undermined. So if we can, and it also means centralization around the president. For example, the Department of State is supposed to serve at the will of the president. Trump threatens to leave the entire multilateral system. Remember during COVID, he left the WHO, which is vital, right? The World Health Organization for countries to cooperate with one another. He left the Paris Climate Agreement and plans to do that again. He plans to take on China. He plans to ramp up nuclear weapons and nuclear testing. Also, international aid is also supposed to be based on U.S. interests, not the idea of human rights or humanitarianism. And he also targets the dislike of what they call woke ideas. So the entire DEI initiatives, the use of identifying things that are discriminatory, gender equity, gender equality, abortion, all of that will go bye-bye. So I think it has some really dire effects for the post-World War II rules-based international system.
Dr. Hardy?
Well, my esteemed fellow panelists have really sort of nailed that down. I was going to speak to a little bit of the global crisis that would only escalate, right? Because Donald Trump wants to be a strong man, and he idolizes other men that he thinks are strong men. And so what he's going to do is he's going to make us look more like Russia, more like North Korea. He's going to try to be this massive dictator who brings a lack of safety, because that's ostensibly what this becomes, is a lack of safety nationally and internationally, where women are not safe to travel. One of the provisions of this thing is that women have to prove they're not pregnant before they travel across state lines, in case they go out pregnant, come back not pregnant because they went to a state that actually allowed abortion. There's a lot that's in this thing, and essentially what it all boils down to, they're even trying to bring back the selective service, where the young men are getting drafted into the military. Like, who do you think that's going to affect first and foremost? And so what we're looking at is a lack of safety nationally and internationally that has, I think, been laid out perfectly well by the other panelists.
Now, of course, as Mr. Richburg Legislative Richburg mentioned, there are a lot of other factors that are involved in this. And some of those key factors of Project 2025 involve dismantling the Department of Justice, FBI, Department of Education. Do you feel that this is a recipe for disaster for the United States? And if so, how? I know that sounds like a leading question, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. Edu?
Thank you, Kevin. As it relates to education, we're already seeing a prelude of what that would look like, right? Back in August 3rd of 2023, one of our leading organizations in the field of education, the National Education Association, put out an article called Florida's New History Standard, a blow to our student and nation. A brief synopsis of the article, it states that slaves benefited from slavery. In Tennessee, the Board of Education in Tennessee played the word game in regards to slavery, involuntary workers. This is just a prelude of what we're expecting, or what we should expect if 2025 is fully implemented, if Trump is elected as president again. So in terms of education, we're talking about the change of history and changing the future's mind, right? When we're talking about diversity issues, right? We're talking about equal opportunity programs. I'm a proud graduate of the University of Albany. I got admitted under the Educational Opportunity Program. I work with a number of students who come from traditionally marginalized communities, who without those opportunity programs would not have had the opportunity to gain a college education. So just a small sample what education would look like. In regards to Department of Justice, what 2025 is looking to do is to punish anybody who talks about what they define as anti-white racism. I don't know what anti-white racism is. I really don't know. But we're talking about pushing an initiative and a narrative that we're trying to make everybody comfortable by not talking about slavery and the effects of slavery in our education system. And then they're talking about the removal of every minority DEI programs in each agency. That's going to affect how we do business and how we progress economically. So these are just a sample of what they're looking to do and execute.
Zakia, Lori, and then Jason.
Okay, so the answer to your question is obviously yes, period. But the next part of it is how. So because the question mentioned the DOJ, the FBI, and the DOE, I'll start with the DOJ. So we have all of this energy and all of this fervor right now that's happening around Vice President Kamala Harris and what it would mean historically when she becomes the president, if she becomes the president of the United States of America. But one of the things that we have been silent on what we've kind of like suppressed is the fact that Sonia Massey was still shot in her face. She still received 3 headshots by police officers who came inside of her house. And it's almost like this incident has become one of the other hashtag incidences, and we are no longer talking about it because we are so hyped about Waltz being the vice president, about the fact that Trump keeps lying about all of these numbers. But when we talk about the DOJ, the Department of Justice has a responsibility and an obligation to ensure that the citizens of the United States of America are safe no matter where we are. They have a responsibility to seek justice. And the minute that we stop talking about the Sonia Masseys, and the minute we stop talking about the Tamir Rices, the minute that we keep on treating these incidences as if they are just a one-off, well, that's another one that happened, then we fall into the trap of being complacent and being quiet people who just say, well, you know what, that's just the way that it is. And it doesn't have to be that way, because data, probability, and the statistics tell us that there will be another police shooting. We don't know who it's going to be, but we know that it will be another one. Case in point, and I'll just give this as an example to support what I'm saying. Tyree Nichols was killed in Tennessee, but before Tyree Nichols was killed in Tennessee, he lived in Sacramento. The population of Black people in Sacramento, California is roughly 13%, just like the national population of Black people. For women, it's about 7%. For men, it's about 6.5%. When Tyree Nichols lived in Sacramento, he had he was 2 times more likely to be killed by the police once he had a negative interaction. And the reason why he didn't get killed is something that I will argue is because Stephon Clark was killed in 2018. But the minute that Tyree Nichols moved from Sacramento and came to Memphis, Tennessee, he was killed because Black people have a 6 times more likely to be killed by the police once they get in Tennessee. So it comes down to probability and statistics, and the DOJ has a responsibility to understand how this probability works and how it impacts the lives of Black people living inside of this country. And we're not doing that good enough. But the Washington Post is keeping a tracker of how many people are shot by the police, but we have to do a lot more than that. In regards to DOE, I'm a lifelong educator. I'm a teacher. I started my career in the New York City Department of Education, Brooklyn. The thing that I'll say about that is when we look at the data, when we look at the metrics and statistics, we have to ask ourselves, why is it that Black children born in the United States of America who are identified as Black American children still remain at the bottom of all of the metrics, even below children who come into this country where English is not even their first language? So there is something systemic that is happening that's creating a narrative that says that Black children cannot and will not learn inside of our schools. And if we look around at what's happening with homeschooling, Black parents, in particular African-American or Black American parents, are the largest demographic who are switching over to the homeschooling movement. But the thing that we don't talk about is something that the Nation of Islam talked about when it came down to homeschooling, is that homeschooling is the only viable option for people who are confronted with systemic racism, oppression, and it is a continuum of it happening. Sister Clara Muhammad, who had an 8th grade education, Elijah Muhammad, who had a 3rd grade education, they came out of rural Georgia. They said that we will not put our children inside of the public school because we know that the public school is only going to damage our children. So they started the modern homeschool movement in America, but we don't talk about it because we think homeschool parents are a bunch of religious fanatics and religious zealots. And we really do have to get away from thinking like that, because the Black Panther Party showed us that when we take control of our schools, we can start programs like Head Start. We can make sure that our children get lunch. We can make sure that our children are fed and they can get everything that they deserve. So clearly, Project 2025 is showing up so that it can be a disruptor in all of the historic things that Black people have traditionally done. But we have to be smarter than that, and we have to realize that we do have the power to make the changes that we want to see for our future, for our children, and for our broader communities. And we have to hold all of these entities accountable for Black life.
Ms. Favors?
So I would just, greetings to all the panelists and the guests. I apologize for my late arrival as I'm currently waiting for roadside assistance. So hopefully you all can hear me and the Wi-Fi is okay. I just wanted to say, with regards to everything Sister Zakia Ali just said so powerfully and eloquently, when it comes to the police, when you consider how little responsibility is taken now, when our lives are taken, police are very rarely charged, very rarely have to go through the criminal legal system themselves, and very rarely have to pay any sort of criminal legal system imposed consequence. But under a Project 2025, you would have the complete distribution of qualified immunity for all acts that police engage in. With Tyree Nichols, those men who took that brother's life, they are facing criminal legal system consequences. And we're seeing that the man who killed Sonia Massey annihilated her and the sanctity of her home, and she was calling on the name of God to keep her safe. He is facing criminal legal charges. Under a Project 2025, that does not happen. Qualified immunity would be given to police officers blanketly. They would be allowed to engage in wholesale style execution, similar to the way that their predecessors, the slave patrols, did. And there would be absolutely no consequence. In addition to that, and this is always a tough one for me to say, because quite frankly, the current status of the criminal legal system is diabolical. However, it is a slight bit less diabolical because of the reforms that activists and organizers have been able to implement. Under a Project 2025, those criminal legal system reforms are eradicated. And that is hugely important for the Department of Justice. For the Department of Education, in addition to everything that was said by my fellow panelists earlier, we also have to recognize that the Department of Education is where integration began. And it's the mandate of the Department of Education is to ensure that everyone in the country has access to a public school education. And although we know it does not happen, done so in a way that is equitable. So if you have a child who is Black and disabled, if you have a child who is multilingual, if you have a child who has special needs, under Project 2025, the public school system does not exist. It will not provide that for them. They plan to cut Head Start. They plan to cut funding for after-school programs because they do not believe that the Department of Education has a lawful mandate because of the racism. It is in the school system where you have a mandate for equity for Black and brown children. It is in the school system, the Department of Education, where you have mandates for equitable treatment for the LGBTQ plus community. It is the school system that mandates equitable access to buildings, to the resources for our differently abled students. And in a Project 2025 America, number one, they eradicate the Department of Education, and they do so because their age-old plan has been from the days of the Brown v. Board of Education decision to return to a time where they did not have to have their children educated with ours. In addition, one of the other challenges that we have under a Project 2025 education concept is the fact that they do not believe in funding public schools. And this is why you see a massive push right now for vouchers. Let us be clear. I am all for school choice. At various times throughout my children's careers, my husband and I have sent them to a charter school when we thought it was more appropriate, Black-led, thankfully. But we have also recognized, and our children are now in public school spaces, and there has to be the ability for parents to have choice. However, what we are seeing with the vouchers program is that a significant portion of the vouchers that are distributed in a variety of states across the country go to wealthy parents who already have their children in private schools, which means it is a transfer of wealth from the public, we the taxpayers, to the wealthy to continue doing what they were already doing. And very few of the vouchers that are distributed vis-a-vis the money that is taken out of the public school system at the state level is actually being assigned to Black and brown children. And in the cases when it is, what we find is that the private schools end up raising the prices and the fees so to exacerbate the difference that the families who were already financially burdened now have to come up with. And when it comes to the Department of Justice, it's important for us to recognize that the Department of Justice is the umbrella under which the Civil Rights Division sits. And every single agency has a Civil Rights Division. Under our Project 2025, let us be clear, the 1964 Civil Rights Act is as gone as Roe v. Wade. And what that means is that piece of legislation, which is the only legislation still standing from the civil rights era, that says you can be as racist as you want to be in the comfort of your own home. You can tell the jokes, you can make the decisions, you can have the conversation. But when you go into the public, you are required to put your racism to the side. So if you are a racist store owner, no, you cannot refuse to service me because I'm Black. If you're a racist hotel operator, no, you cannot refuse to house me because I'm Black. If you're a racist school system, a hospital, you cannot refuse to serve me because I am Black. What a Project 2025 America will do, however, is it will eradicate the civil rights movement, which means we literally go back to the age of Jim Crow. And I know that we often say, you know, integration was one of the most challenging and things that happened to us. I get it. I've said it. I understand it. However, when we were segregated, we had the community infrastructure to absorb a lot, not all, but to absorb a lot of this. We understood that your only opportunity for a job was going to be working for a Black-owned business. We recognize that if you wanted housing equitably, you should probably have a Black landlord, or you should be purchasing with and using funds in a Black bank. We currently do not have the community infrastructure to absorb the reality that we will have to endure if we go back to a Project 2020 6 months from now, because we talking inauguration is January. So if this happens and they have a 100, that Project 2025, it's the first 180 days. They don't even need a full year because they have been in planning and implementation mode. How much time do you think it's going to take us to create enough Black-owned businesses to absorb the numbers of us that are going to be dismissed from the places that were already trying to hire as few of us as they possibly could get away with without facing a lawsuit for discrimination? How many hospitals can we build as quickly as we possibly can when private hospitals are no longer required to service us? How many schools can we build up and staff up and sustain in an environment where that is no longer going to be provided by the federal government? So for me, the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, all of these agencies, and there are so many implications, and this plan is so evilly beautiful that it is impressive in its scope and granularity, and that is what keeps me up at night.
Wow, that was a lot to absorb, and the comments coming in left and right saying, go ahead, Sora, and preach on and everything. And I love that phrase, so evilly beautiful. I think I'm going to steal that and remember that. But Legislator Richburg?
See, Michael lowered his hand before I could. He's too quick. So I want to add to what was said. And I think part of it is, when we talk about the Department of Education, one of the things with the free breakfast and free lunches that we have for students all over our country, mostly in New York State, that's going to be taken out too. And that's in the US, that's the USDA, not Department of Education. There are about 30 police agencies right now, when we talk about Department of Justice, that are under consent decrees. And what those consent decrees do is they follow those cases that happened that were talked about by Sister Ali before, right? So the Department of Justice goes in and they have communication with the communities. They meet with the activists, they meet with the police departments and the executives of those agencies, and they say, this is what you need to do in order to be better. Sometimes the Department of Justice has also sued those localities when they did not adhere to those justice decrees. The other thing I will follow up with the Department of Justice is not so much the dismantling of the Department of Justice, what will be set up in its place. Because if you're sitting up something different in its place, to what end? Because again, we're getting rid of the civil service system. So by creating a police force that will only be responded to the executive, I'll say that again, you're creating a nationalized police force that will only be responsive to the executive. You are going to create ultimate chaos when you talk about who is going to be affected and how they will be punished. And when you talk about the conversation between blue states and blue cities and red states and red cities, you will understand how these things will be enacted and how dangerous it is for all of us. Because if you say something against the president, they could then send this new nationalized police force to your door, right? Those buses that are coming up from other states into New York City, those will be ushered in by federal law enforcement that will be accountable only to the president, which also takes out a meritocracy, right? Which doesn't mean that the good work that you do, whether I'm a child of someone who was a civil servant, worked at 26 Federal Plaza right across from the World Trade Center, okay? He worked his way up. My mother made sure he applied for that job. She probably filled out the application. I think the statute of limitations is over for that. But the main thing is that he was able to be an accountant with the Inspector General's office in our federal government. And so what that did, as he as an Inspector General, he went to all those places that were not doing the justice work they were supposed to be doing, dumping in our communities, putting radioactive chemicals in our communities. All of those things will be taken down. So yes, we're talking about the Department of Justice. We're also talking about the Inspector General's office. When you talk about the folks who are traveling abroad, you as an American citizen, if you travel abroad, you are protected by United States laws. That's what was reflected early. And so by dismantling all of these pieces, you are going to see the eradication of America. Going back to the Department of Education, I believe we are 26th in the nation, in 26th in the world in educational policies, 26 in test scores, 26 in math, and I think we're even lower in reading. And so by dismantling the Department of Education, what you're also doing is you're automatically making it a have and have not system when it comes to education and success for all of our children, regardless of where you're coming from. And that is why this is so dangerous.
You know, I did on my educational radio show, I actually did a tribute to because we just celebrated the 70 years since Brown v. Board of Ed. And we talked about how in today's educational landscape, it seems as if we have kind of almost reverted back to a segregated school system. If you look at how the schools are set up, a lot of the schools are, because of mobility or what have you, and use of vouchers and so forth, a lot of schools are de facto segregated schools now, and because again, just because of happenstance. So how will Project 2025, and I think we touched on it a little bit, but how will Project 2025 kind of just exacerbate that problem, or even to further that return to an era when segregation was the norm? Zakia?
I was just going to say, we talk about segregation as if it's a bad thing, or as if it's a taboo. And I don't find it necessarily to be a taboo when we think about how Black education was being administered from the quarter communities to even the homeschoolings that we have today in 2024. The conversation is not whether or not it's segregation against integration. It's about the content that's happening inside of these classrooms. So just because we have integration happening, what is the quality of that education? In 1935, W.B. Du Bois, he wrote an essay, and the question was, does the Negro need separate schools? And initially he answered the question, yes, they do need separate schools, and they need teachers who are going to afford them with love, and teachers who are going to affirm their culture, and teachers who are going to do all of these things. But by the end of the essay, he said, we do need separate schools, but only if those separate schools are actually going to look like Black institutions and not a replication of white institutions where we're trying to be something and be people who we are not. So I don't think that, again, segregation is not the worst thing that can happen, but I do believe that in our schools, we cannot have reading and writing and arithmetic without having a political understanding and a political basis. This is Black August. We're talking about somebody like Septima Clark, who decides that she wants to make sure that Black teachers can teach in the high school in South Carolina. She's coming out of the low country. Both of her parents are coming out of South Carolina. And she says, okay, let me see if I can get Black teachers so that they can start teaching inside of the local high school. She gets denied this opportunity. So what does she do? She turns around and she creates, or she co-founds, the citizen school model. So in the citizen school model, she's teaching people how to be citizens. She's teaching people the understanding of citizenship, but she's also teaching us the basics of civics. How do you participate inside of a world that is hostile to you politically? How do you understand the structures that are happening around you? And I believe that even though we do teach social studies, I'm a social studies teacher. I'm a permanently licensed social studies teacher. So I do teach civics inside of the classroom, but in a wider frame and outside of the K through 12 model. How do we teach civics to the community so that the community is empowered to do a lot of the work that Septima Clark was empowering Black people to do at that time in a world that was a lot more hostile openly than what it is now. So I think that that has to be a part of our school system rather than being caught up inside of the fact that schools, that we have integration. Because when you really look at it, schools are a lot more segregated, especially in a place where people think integration happens so freely. Look at New York State. Look at New York State, you think you're in Mississippi. Look at Brooklyn, you think you're in Mississippi. And everybody think, oh, this is the Republic of Brooklyn. But if you go in Brooklyn, you will find a large amount of segregation inside of those schools because parents are making choices about who they want their children to sit beside, to think beside, to ride beside, to eat beside, and all of these other besides. And parents are making that choice and saying, no, not on my watch. And so we have integrated, segregated schools right in front of our eyes right now.
Lori?
Yeah, so I'm over here snapping it in the amen corner because everything the sister said was correct. And I would add to that that one of the exacerbative impacts of Project 2025 is that there is a real anti-social emotional learning bent to the right-wing policies driving education. So even though we have very segregated schools, more segregated, and there are reports that show that New York City is actually more segregated now than it ever was at any point before, as are a number of districts. What we also have is the reality that during actual segregation, de facto and de jure segregation, we had Black excellence in education. You might be getting taught by somebody who was an engineer and a scientist, because education was one of the places where most of our brilliant college graduates, and not to say that you have to be a college graduate in order to be brilliant, but during that era, a lot of them ended up teaching. And within 10 years of Brown v. Board of Education coming down, white parents deciding they did not want their children being educated next to ours, basically shut down a significant portion of schools, such that we lost up to 40% of Black teachers in the classroom and nearly 90% of Black superintendents and administrators, which means that those decades of excellence in teaching in the model that Sister Zakiya just talked about were in many ways lost. And we currently have crops of teachers, educators, regardless of race, who are being trained according to a European education model that does rarely prepare them to meet the specific needs that Black and brown children bring to the classroom. Having said that, social emotional learning, the resources that our children provide, because when they are coming into the classroom, they are bringing with them their traumas, they are bringing with them their successes, their gifts, skills, talents, and the weight of all the challenges that we are navigating in our community. And in those schools, ideally, they would have guidance counselors. We know that doesn't always happen, but that would be the ideal. Ideally, there would be after-school programs. There would be programming that would allow them to think critically, that would build on what they're learning in the education during the day in an after-school environment. All of the youth programs that we send our children to, the summer youth employment, the aftercare programs, the before care programs, the supplemental programs, all of that is cut in a Project 2025 America. So the reality that, yes, we currently have segregation, we do not have segregation in the spirit that Zakiya was just talking about, because that's Septima Clark segregation. That's a different type. That's an empowering space that was created. What we have right now is Black principals and teachers who often have to whisper about providing Black children the specific needs, that the ability to meet the needs that they have. And in a Project 2025 America, those whispers are silenced because the funding, the apparatus, the resources to provide for our children with their needs outside of what's specific to the classroom is gone. And the inequitable funding that we currently have, and remember, 4 out of the 5, I believe it was 4 out of the 5 cases that were combined in Brown v. Board of Education, only one of them wanted to be in white schools. The rest of them were like, give us the resources. Forget the school. We tired of passing 5011 schools on our way to the one school that we can attend, even though our tax dollars funded the 5011 schools we had to pass because of segregation. So the idea that it could get worse is something we need to be very mindful of. And I know it's not great now. Trust me, I understand that it's not. But we have a real community appreciation for just how bad it could get if this reality is something that they're able to implement.
Dr. Sharp?
Yes,
And
I
then
just
Dr.
like
Hart.
that. Yeah, I just like to add to that. These are excellent points. It's hard to follow such powerful arguments. But I will say this though: part of Project 2025 is also it also disempowers the FBI from pursuing from pursuing the blockage of misinformation. And from what I see as an educator, and many of us are educators here, is that there's a lot of misinformation out there that's being facilitated by the internet, where I have students who believe that they're lizard people in Congress and so on. The other thing is that education itself is something that has been poo-pooed by the general public. So it's not so surprising that the Department of Education would be eliminated, which is really unfortunate. But just imagine this. If education is being poo-pooed by the general public, imagine what's happening to Black people. And I teach in a historically Black school, or a predominantly Black and immigrant school. And for example, we're talking about teachers and Black education. Most of the students I talk to don't want to be teachers. Okay, how do we change that whole discourse? They'll say things like, "I'll be on welfare if I'm a teacher," which is not true. Certainly not in New York City as a full-time teacher, but misinformation abounds. And we need to do something about that, and to really educate our students, our children. Thanks.
Dr. Hardy?
So a few things. I was invoked when my fellow panelists said the social emotional health, because before I was a professor, I was a school social worker in the K-12 system in DC, in Baltimore, in Chicago. And so if we don't have guidance counselors, imagine that's so much worse when we don't have school social workers, because they bring one of us in to work at 3 to 5 different schools around the city, which is this absolute madness. But I've been fortunate that I've always just been able to be in one particular school at a time, which has been valuable, because there are times where those social workers have taken on almost the sort of fictive kinship role of parents or aunties or uncles and, trusted adults in their lives that they may not even have at home. So yes, that's going to get so much worse. I mean, we can see that just from COVID, and that there's been so little attention paid to the mental health of the teachers and the students, and the impact that that's had. But when we talked about, you all talked about segregated schools, and yeah, everything that you all said is absolutely spot on. But I also want us to remember that if you are low income, you are never seeing the inside of an integrated classroom, right? Like, it's just not going to happen, unless you're in a low income mixed race community, and those tend not to exist. And so so it doesn't even matter that we have like schools where Black kids and white kids sit next to each other and learn nothing about each other's culture, really, or a bastardized version of it. Because there are some schools where just because of your parents' income, just because of the zip code, that school's just always going to stay the way that it is, which I am with Sister Ali, that doesn't mean it doesn't have to be a high performing, well functioning, really sound and equitable school. It just means that it's not going to be as racially diverse. And I don't know that that was ever truly the goal. In North Carolina, the state legislature, which has been controlled by the Republicans for some time now, they control our state Supreme Court. And last year, before they had so much power, this case that had been taking forever, literal decades to get through this Supreme Court system, called the Leandro case, that talked about how the public school system and the state legislature's funding of it violated our North Carolina Constitution, that every child would receive a free and fair public education, because they weren't funding those schools. They finally found that to be just. And then the only thing that changed a year later was the makeup of the state Supreme Court. And of their own volition, they said, we want to run that back and look at that again, and decided, no, that's not constitutionally, that's not in a constitutional violation. So when it was found that it was a violation of the Constitution, they didn't put any money in, because the finding said that there would have to be millions of dollars put back into this certain set of schools. That wasn't done. And then when the state Supreme Court changed after the next election cycle, because there's an election cycle in North Carolina every year, they decided that it's not unconstitutional. And so there it is. And the most recent budget for the state legislature that they've already passed takes $500 million of public dollars and puts them into unaccountable private schools that can teach whatever version of religion these people want. They're not bound by the state's curriculum. Like, it's absolutely insane. And it's unfortunate to hear that it's happening literally up and down the coast. But with Project 2025, that's only going to get so much worse. I will end this point with this, because I know you have other questions and stuff, but I had to go to Wilmington, North Carolina a few times. Wilmington, the site of the 1898 massacre. That feels like it happened yesterday because of just how bad it still is down there. Their school board was being pushed to ban Ibram Kendi's book about how to be an anti-racist. And so I went down there a couple of times, push, and there were parents who came in. This is a school board meeting. I don't know what it's like in New York, but in the average school board meeting, it is a sleepy, boring, not very well attended, meeting. These meetings have 3 different police forces: the city, the state, the county, inside and outside of the building. News cameras are there. They have people quarantined off to the side. Those of us that got to come inside weren't allowed to stand unless we were giving our little 2-minute spiel at the mic. We get in there and there's all these people taking their 2 minutes to go up and talk about how much they care about their children's education and yada, yada, yada. And for the public comment section, public comment ended after like an hour. The board took an 8-minute break. Everybody left. They hadn't even got to the agenda yet, because the only agenda item they cared about was about this book ban. After a couple of months of this, where the board members themselves read the book, where all of these people came out and talked about it, I got up at the mic and said some stuff. They decided to temporarily ban the book about how to be an anti-racist until a book could be found that presented the other side of the argument, which I would argue was written many years ago, called Mein Kampf, but that's another book for another time, right? So, I mean, if you want the other side of a book about not being racist, then let's get that book off the shelf. But like, that's the sort of stuff that we're dealing with in 2024 at a sleepy school board meeting in Wilmington, North Carolina. And so that's not going to have to happen under Project 2025, because it's just going to become policy that books that teach us about each other, teach our kids to stand next to each other as neighbors and friends, will be banned. Which, by the way, I just want to say this. I know I said I was going to stop, but I am right now. That's also going to harm their kids in ways that they don't really realize, in ways that they really don't want to acknowledge. If you've ever been a parent of a little person, I have, my beside me, frustrated that I'm on the Zoom, but I got to be here with my people. They will get on a playground and they will play together and they will act like there's nothing that separates them at all. And it is the intentional infusion of bias and hatefulness by the parents that separates those kids from one another, and never brings them, they'll never get a path back to understand how those things their parents taught them were wrong and hurtful and harmful. So these things don't they don't just harm our kids, they harm the global society, because it teaches us not to learn about one another, not to trust one another, and not to be neighbors to one another.
Thank you all for your responses to that last question. We do have a question that's coming from one of the viewers who's watching on YouTube. And I do encourage all of you, once again, who are viewing, to please post your questions as well. But this question is actually directed towards Dr. Sharp. In regards to immigration, how will Project 2025 affect other countries and how they treat American citizens? Will they also follow suit according to what 2025 lays out?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, I mean, it would seem pretty logical that they would. Project 2025 promises to target certain nationalities and certain groups from not entering the United States or not getting visas and so on. So, and very often countries will retaliate, and say, okay, no visa for you. The U.S. and France, we had that at one point in the 1980s, 1990s. So I think it's entirely plausible and probable that the other countries would do the same.
And I guess everybody, this one also for everyone, kind of along the same lines, because we know that Project 2025 in some part talks about mass deportations. So how will that impact not only the citizenship of the United States, but also those coming from abroad?
Can I take a stab at this one, Kevin?
Dr. Hardy, please.
Because so first of all, we have to remember you can't deport people back to a country that isn't home. And for a lot of folks who came over as children, wherever they're being sent back to is not really home to them, right? And so the displacement of people, we can talk about that as people of the diaspora. What does that mean to be displaced, to be sent back to a space or sent to a space that you don't recognize, that you don't know, that isn't home? It's disjointing you from your community, you from the society that you've known forever. It also puts an extremely significant burden on the countries that will receive those very people. It'll put an economic burden, a social burden, a political burden, and that could very well lead to all manner of political discourse. I would take you back to Hurricane Katrina. And when folks were being displaced by the hurricane in Louisiana and making their way over to Texas and places like that, there was an initial welcoming because they understood that your displacement was not by your own hand. But then there was a point at which there became a strain on systems. There became a strain on spaces. And I think that strain could happen in this way too. And then there became the same people who were so welcoming and ingratiating really started to have a lot of pushback, a lot of tension, and there was some conflict there. But again, I go back to this thing, and I only go back to it because I want to mention this in this way. It's so short-sighted. Their hatefulness and ignorance is so short-sighted, because if you take these folks out of our country, out of our society, you also take them out of our businesses that rely on them. Remember Arizona, when they were doing this thing about, people had to walk around basically with the freedom papers if they were Latino to make sure that people knew that they were really citizens of the country. But when it was understood that there was going to be this sort of mass deportation effort over there, folks just up and moved overnight. And all of these businesses that depended on them nearly just fell into collapse. And so they don't even recognize how this hateful, ignorant rhetoric that they're pushing is not just going to be harmful to the people who are going to be subject to it, but in the direct way, but this indirect impact on the economy, on these businesses, on communities, like it's going to hurt them too. And so, if what we're saying is that we want a society, we want a country that isn't negatively impacted by Project 2025, then that means we have to get them to understand too, you're doing more damage to yourselves than you're being told you are, and then that you realize you are.
Lori, and then Zakia.
So one of the ways I often answer this question is, how do you right now, if someone were to knock at your door and have a badge and a gun, how would you prove you're a citizen? Like what paperwork if you're driving down I-95 and you get pulled over and they say, in addition to license and registration, we need to see your proof of citizenship. How do we prove that? Most Black people do not have a passport. Most Americans, let's be clear, don't have a passport. And most of us don't travel around with our birth certificate or social security card. And so when we're thinking about what this means, there were years ago, I lived in the Dominican Republic studying the role of race in Latin American culture. And I remember getting on a bus and there were very brown skinned, just for the record, everybody on this panel right now could be Dominican in terms of how we look, our phenotype, so on and so forth, how we present. And I'm on the bus and these very brown skinned Dominicans are not allowed on the bus because it was presumed they were Haitian. And the bus driver, and obviously this is a different country, different context, but I just want to give you an example as to how this plays out in other countries where this is the norm. And I was there during a time where there was a mass deportation of Haitian people out of the Dominican Republic. And there were many Dominicans that were included in that mass deportation, wrongfully deported because the officers who accosted them presumed that they were Haitian. When you couple this plan for mass deportations with 100% qualified police immunity, if you spend 6, 7, 8 months locked up in a holding cell because you're trying to prove that you really are a citizen, and maybe you're born in a rural community where you did or did not get a birth certificate, maybe you have access to information to prove you do, maybe you got to request your social security card from the Social Security Administration, which under Project 2025 America is now going to be operated by the 50,000 people who are replacing the civil servants because they are so loyal to Donald Trump. So you are now going to have to waste your time trying to establish your citizenship. And when we consider the fact that nearly 15% of the people being held at the border are people of African descent, this is not a hard path. It's not a hard thing to understand. And when it comes to the self-inflicted wounds, one thing we know from American history is that white Americans who have subscribed to a white supremacist ideology are more than happy to cut off their nose, lips, and ears in order to spite their racist faces. And what this means is they have already in some ways thought through how they would respond. When you have at the same time the removal of child labor protections, you have in states like Louisiana where they have expanded the number of crimes that would allow children to be incarcerated. And those children, once incarcerated, subjected to the 13th Amendment loophole, just like the adults, and the adults in Louisiana facing an expansion of what is defined as criminality as well, they will quickly be able to replace the migrant population with the prison slave labor that they've already made accommodations for. So this is, and again, the granularity, the level of detail and depth, again, evilly beautiful. And the efforts for mass deportation includes mass holding of people, neighbor turning on neighbor. I spent a significant portion of my childhood in Germany. My parents were military. And what we learned about how German neighbor was able to turn against German neighbor, it did not take a lot because you're living under a surveillance state where you are incentivized to snitch on your neighbors. You are incentivized to participate in the violence that the state was trying to execute as against the people. So the mass deportation is really just one additional way of opening up the door for wholesale oppression and repression and the revitalization of the prison industrial complex, such that that 13th Amendment loophole becomes the biggest gaping opening for us to walk back into what essentially becomes a prison-based labor system.
Zakia?
I just want to say, yes, panel peers. I mean, because everybody is just like bringing such good information. And I feel like that our conversation is a challenge to ourselves, but also to everybody that's listening about how do we put ourselves inside of this conversation and figure out what we're going to do. How do we be the change that we want to see? So I first wanted to say that, but in regards to this conversation around mass deportation, it's a continuum conversation, right? So Project 2025 didn't start the conversation about mass deportation because we know under the Obama administration that mass deportations were happening before any of us were talking about Project 2025. But we know that the Heritage Foundation was already around and had already put these wheels into motion. But when we think about the United States of America and we think about, if we only talk about deportation through an American context and through an American lens, we know that it has already happened in the United States of America with the American Colonization Society. 1821, Black Americans were deported. Whether we want to say that they immigrated out of the United States or whatever, they were deported out of the United States of America and sent to Liberia because there was no option. So if your option is to remain enslaved or to go back to Africa, what you gonna do? You're going to take the option where you're going to be free and where you're going to be humanized. And we see how that relationship between Liberia and Black America and the United States of America is going today. We still have to figure out ways that we can heal those wounds because it takes a long time, but we're talking about centuries that those gaping wounds have been opened because of America's decision to do mass deportation. And so the question becomes, what or how do we redefine these rules around entry, around points of demarcation, around points of exit? What do we do, and how do we advocate to the government to say that these are the ramifications that's going to happen when you deport people at a mass level, and also this is what's going to happen when you think about or how can we change the system so that immigration becomes a system that's less cumbersome than what it is right now?
Dr. Sharp.
I know we're running out of time, but I just want to just echo on these excellent points. You know, in international law, in the beginning of this conversation, I said that the Trump administration and this Project 2025 threatens to undermine the whole liberal democratic order. Now, there's a principle in international law called the principle of non-refoulement. And what that means is that any country that's a party to this treaty or the refugee treaty, you cannot send somebody back to a country where they will where you know they'll be persecuted or for various reasons. So by deporting all these people, it really does undermine the United States and its image, and Europe is sure to follow course because they already have with Fortress Europe. This is why we're seeing so many people at the border in Latin America. So it threatens to undermine the entire liberal democratic world. And I will add to that America's soft power, America's standing in the world. Joseph Nye, a political scientist at Harvard, developed this concept called soft power. This is not military or hard power. This is what makes a country attractive to people. For example, its ideals, its liberal ideals. It's the idea in America that it's not true that anyone can become rich, right? Rags to riches. These ideas drive talent to the United States from all over the world. Look at Silicon Valley. And what this whole thing does is it actually undermines American power in the end, American soft power. So there's a dual threat, a threat to the whole international refugee and asylum system, to immigration, and a threat to actually, ironically, America's standing in the world. Thanks.
No, thank you all for this part of our conversation. And I know we could literally go on all evening talking about all the different aspects of Project 2025.
Kevin, can I just add one more point to that, to what Brother Sharp just said? What's also important is that the United States, as most Northern Hemisphere countries, have a negative birth rate. And so what we're seeing, one of the problems that we have in this conversation, we talk about mass deportation or immigration, is that there was a point in time where our families were having 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kids. Now people are having one child, maybe two, right? And so in this, what you're also creating is a lack of workforce, a lack of educational experience, a lack of depth in our communities. So this mass deportation, Brother Sharp is 100% right. It is going to mess up the standing of the United States, because at this point in time, the only reason why we have a positive birth rate is because of immigration. And if we got rid of immigration tomorrow, you will see a serious deleterious effects on every aspect of our economy and of our culture.
Thank you for adding that. That was a very important point to bring up. But like I said, if we could talk about all the different aspects of Project 2025 for the rest of the evening. But I don't want to just stay there, because we do have some other things. And as somebody in our chat pointed out, can we just go ahead and acknowledge that there are some aspects of Project 2025 that are already being enacted? Anyway, I want to shift gears a little bit. And let's talk about the Kamala Harris effect somewhat. Again, we'll throw a couple of questions out there, and I know there are a lot of people who are watching us on Zoom and otherwise that are also chomping at the bit to be able to ask you all some questions as well. But I'm going to start this off here with, and this may sound like a loaded question, but how do you feel about Vice President Harris's potential as president? And we're talking about positive and negative sides. So don't just think you have to think about one aspect. So if anybody wants to begin. Edu?
Well, first and foremost, I'm truly excited that Sister Kamala Harris will have the opportunity to be president of the United States. Just a few months ago, Joe Biden was down 4 percentage points, 5 percentage points in regards to his predicted polls and how he'll perform in the general election. As of recently, Vice President Kamala Harris is up 4 percentage points. And when we're looking at the Rust Belt states and Sun Belt states, she will perform extremely well based on the polls. My concerns with Vice President Kamala, should she become the president, is the infrastructure that she would have to deal with as president of the United States. Many of the obstacles that President Obama had to face. You're always going to have the internal gatekeepers that like to keep the status quo. And how do we help her move our agenda, especially Black and brown communities, to push our agendas for equity and economic opportunity, to fight health inequalities? The D9 has stepped up tremendously in regards to this race. They have organized nationally, they have raised funds, and they have gotten young people more excited about this race that the Joe Biden effect simply did not have. She brings a new energy to this race that simply excites everybody at the possibilities of what can come.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in here?
I mean, I could just add that, I mean, I think the energy is amazing that has shown forth in about less than 8 weeks. But I think the issue that I have is, you know, we have this, I had a professor who called it the Messiah effect, and that we think that we're going to elect this one person and that Messiah will change the world. And the reality is we need a President Harris, but we also need a Democratic Senate. We need a Democratic House of Representatives. So we need Speaker Hakeem Jeffries to be instituted, but we also need that to happen on state levels as well. And I think what happened after the 2016 election is folks were living in this bubble and just believed that everything was just blue everywhere and everybody was just Democratic and we all were just skipping down the hills, right? And there was no idea of what the outside of those blue states and those blue areas really was. And I think the negative is this hope that we put in one person and not doing the work for the other folks so that person has a team behind them. I think the other thing that's important is to understand the amount of people of color, women in leadership that were in the Biden administration, and that opportunity to keep those folks or add more folks to that administration. I think that is important because when you have women and men of color in administration in positions of leadership, you are able to change these discussions that we're talking about right now about Project 2025, about those main issues that are affecting our communities. One more thing that worries me is that I hear a lot of folks with some comments about her past and comments about whether what she's done as Attorney General or when she was district attorney and her work. And well, I'm not voting for her because of this, and this. And they won't vote for her, but a no vote for her at this point in time, you're talking about, you're voting yes for Project 2025, right? And so I think, and the other issue I'll add to that is those folks who bullet vote. And those bullet votes who vote for Harris and skip everybody else. And we all know that presidential elections, you have a higher voter turnout, right? That's why in New York State, they're working on having, elections for every office every 2 years, not every other year or stagnated how it is now. But we need to make sure that folks understand that there are folks all down the ballot, from president down to dog catcher, who need to be elected. And those are the questions we need to be asking, because those are the folks who are really going to make the change about what happens on our day-to-day lives, as well as the president.
Zakia?
So the elephant in the room is that Vice President Kamala Harris was none of our candidate when she was on the campaign trail. That's the elephant in the room that we don't talk about, is that there was a lot of apprehension that people had when Kamala Harris was first running, and she wasn't able to make it far inside of the presidential race because of whatever the apprehension was. I mean, people have their reasons why they choose to vote in one direction or another direction, but whatever the reason was, it was a reason. And it was a reason why she did not become, or why she wasn't the presidential candidate. The positive thing that I will say about Kamala Harris is that I do like that under her administration that Black farmers were able to get $2 billion. And Black farmers are owed $2 billion, but it doesn't stop with them just being able to get a class action lawsuit of getting $2 billion. I am the great grandchild of sharecroppers and farmers in the United States, Black farmers in the United States of America. And when these Black farmers, primarily Black American farmers, are getting this money, which they were supposed to get $5 billion, but under the Trump administration, 0.1% of those farmers were able to get $20 million, and white farmers got $26 billion. So Black farmers are still not getting what they are completely owed, but at least under this administration where Kamala Harris is the vice president, Black farmers have been able to benefit. But I think the thing that I'm most interested in looking at and seeing play out, if you will, is how racial identity or the politics of race and identity is going to play out under Kamala Harris because, you see Westmore, his lieutenant governor is Indian. You see J.D. Vance, his wife is Indian. You see Kamala Harris, she is the daughter of a Tamil Indian woman. And so we use the language Black and brown, but brown also applies to Indian people from the subcontinent of East India. And we oftentimes don't think about how when you pick up the phone to get some service, the person on the other end, they sound like, when you listen to the accent, they sound like they might be people who are in India, or they can be from Pakistan, or they can be from any of the countries that identify as brown people across the nation. So I'm really interested in how identity politics are going to play out differently with Kamala Harris than they did with President Obama, because both of them have a phenotype, both of them have an image that we see. But I think the thing that scares me the most and that helped us to embrace Obama the most was the spouses. So because Michelle Obama was a South Side Chicago Black American woman whose family endured the transatlantic slave trade, it some kind of way made her and him feel more relatable to Black people in the United States of America. And when I think about Kamala Harris's husband, I mean, and of course we shouldn't, whatever, her spouse is Jewish. And we know that a lot of money is going over to Israel. And we know that the Israeli policies towards Black people and brown people is horrible. And we know that they do practice genocide. And that's just the reality of it. We've seen how it's being played out. And we've also seen Kamala Harris stand in front of AIPAC and give speeches in front of AIPAC. So what is that going to mean moving forward in the United States of America for foreign policy? But what is it going to mean for the global scale of Black people in South Africa? What is it going to mean for Black people on the continent of Africa who get a lot of their resources from Israel, who get a lot of their resources, and Asian people who get a lot of their resources from Israel? So we have to think about those things. And I'm interested in seeing how that's going to play out in terms of identity politics.
Glory?
So yes, I just wanted to add the person who spoke, the panelist who spoke just before Zakia, and I just wanted to add that when it comes to the things that we need to send the Senate, we need to send the House, we need to do this at the local level, all up and down the ballot, but we also need a Black community, a Black electorate that's willing to make demands. And what I mean by that is a lot of times we get caught up in the politics of representation such that it feels amazing to have Barack Obama and Michelle Obama in the White House. Like Black Camelot felt really good. But one of the challenges that came with Black Camelot was Black people still sort of grappling with what it means to have representation and not necessarily being willing to hold elected officials accountable politicians at all. And I think they are a useful employee in the service of community. But we have to remember that politics is simply the science of distributing resources. Those resources might be clean water, access to schools, teachers, books in the school, healthcare centers, libraries, library hours. It is literally the distribution of resources, roads, housing, pipes to your home so that you have effective plumbing. And politicians are just the people that we hire to make the resource distribution allocation decisions. And when it comes to identity, when it comes to morality and who she used to be, and you know, I had a conversation with somebody recently. I was like, they were bringing up the whole, when she was a DA, she was locking up people, and I said, well, she was focused on sex crimes and abusers. So whomever was getting locked up, we might want to interrogate some things as opposed to just believing headlines and not interrogating and doing the actual work of digging into what that work looked like. We might want to find out why at that time she was considered one of the most progressive prosecutors in the nation, why it was that she was one of the people who was leading in terms of criminal legal system reforms that are now sort of just accepted as that's what we do. But back in 2006, when she was doing it, in the early 2000s rather, it was not normal to have prosecutors talking about reentry programs and anti-recidivism programs. And she was somebody who was out in front. So we have to, one, educate our folks, but we have to ensure that as an electorate, we are not going to trap ourselves in this notion that we do not hold Black elected officials accountable and we do not make demands. And I can look to, well, I can look to local leadership. And I, as an example, and put in whomever you will in this example, I can look at, okay, somebody dropped it in the chat. We can look at local leadership right now. Half the policies coming out of local leadership in New York City, if the leadership were not from the community, people would be protesting in the street. The devastation that has happened in terms of budgeting, in terms of policies that have had an anti-Black impact, we would be protesting if we were not as concerned with representation. So we also need, in addition to sending her the Congress, sending her representatives who will fight and vote for these legislations to get passed into law, we have to be willing to make demands. And when I'm in conversation with members of her team and they're saying, what is it that you want? I have to ask them, how do you ask of people who are used to not getting things to dream big? Like, we have to do the work of figuring out how we feel such that we are willing to make the demands. We are willing to hold accountable. We're willing to have the tough conversations, and we're willing to say, we're going to put you in office because we want to extrapolate benefits to our community. And I understand that the word tangibles has a very sensitive moment right now, but the reality is politicians are supposed to be in our work in our benefit. And so as much as we have to send her those elements, and we have to do that at the local, state, and federal level, we also have to be audacious with our demands. Yeah, it's one thing to request body cameras so we have proof that y'all racist when you kill us, but I'd rather say that we want to end to qualified immunity completely. Yeah, it's one thing to say we're going to get a settlement when you destroy us and take our lives, but I'd rather say that settlement shouldn't be coming from the taxes that we are already paying, because we're paying your salary, and because your police settlements for police brutality also come from the city coffers, we're also paying for the harm that you caused us. I would rather we ask for an end to qualified immunity and an allocation of the fiscal responsibility for taking our lives back to the police precinct. So we can demand more, we can ask for more, we can require more, and we can remember that you need to take your moral questions to your faith-based institution. Handle your moral conversations with your pastor, your preacher, your imam, your rabbi, but do not bring your morals and the voting booth. I know this is irreverent. They ain't got nothing to do with each other. We have to be cold, calculating, and ruthless when it comes to how we are engaging with the ballot, because these people are cold, calculating, and ruthless with their desire, willingness, and surgical precision in eradicating our rights. So I hope that as we are excited about putting her in the office, as we're envisioning the better environment it will be to work under with her in office as opposed to Trump, the reality is, if all we do is dance the electric slide on the lawn, and I get it, I understand it, I know people want the pictures, I recently was there dancing on the line, I understand, but that can't be all of it, and we cannot silence those activists in our community who are going to make those demands, rightfully so, because dancing in Black Camelot feels good, but it does not substantive change make, and we are continuing to pay the price for not effectively making demands when we could have in the past. And so I'm hopeful that we will bring that change to this electoral conversation as well.
Zakia, please add on to that.
It's not going to be much in long because, you know, come on, Sister Lauren Favors. Yes, giving us all this good favor. Yes, honey. But what I will say is that we have been doing elections for eons, and we still shouldn't be asking for a Black agenda. And in 1956, W.B. Du Bois, he did this article. He wrote an article and he said, "Why I Won't Vote." And he talked about how he had voted in 12 different elections. And in 1956, he had decided, look, I'm just not going to vote no more. I voted as a Democrat, and I voted as a Democrat. I voted in this party, I voted in that party, till he got to the point where he was just tired of voting. I'm not in any way advocating for anybody on this call to abstain from voting. That's your right. It's your birthright. In this democratic process, you have the right to vote. So if you want to use it, then you use your vote. But what I am saying is that we have been asking for a Black agenda and demanding for a Black agenda to be fulfilled as if we already don't know what Black people want and what Black people need inside of this country, to the point where it's becoming you playing in my face, just by keep telling us, oh, well, she need to have a Black agenda, as if she doesn't already know what the needs are, as if she already doesn't recognize, as we already don't recognize that there cannot be a Black permanent underclass in this country, and nobody should even be thinking that it is viable for there to be a permanent Black underclass inside of this country, because were it not for Black people inside of this country, the United States of America would not be the place that everybody is clamoring to get into. And that's just the reality of the matter. So we have to start talking about things real and having a real conversation. This panel is called Real Talk. We have to start having real talk about what is at stake for everybody in the United States of America, not just for the people that we deem viable, not just for the people that we deem as not being a permanent underclass and not needing to be the permanent underclass in the United States of America. So I just wanted to throw that out there, no matter who the candidate is. And even with Kamala Harris, we have to hold her as accountable as we will hold anybody else. And it's obvious that there is trepidation with talking about Kamala Harris, because we see the response was very slow, even in this setting. So the question becomes, why? Why is there trepidation? And how come we can't do what Iyanla Vanzant said this morning, call a thing a thing?
No, and I think that's where we are right now, as far as how do we hold Vice President Harris accountable, and just thinking about all the other issues that are going, as was mentioned earlier, that I think it's been a slow drive to support Harris, because, like you said, she didn't win the first time, as far as the nomination was, when she actually ran for the presidential nomination. So it seems as if she's almost been gifted this position now, this nomination now. And so now, how do we hold her accountable for all those other issues that we know that's coming up? But before, there is a question that came from one of our viewers about how does the president and the Senate, thinking about the impact that they're going to have on our federal judges, what would be the influence, or how much influence would the next president and Senate have on the selection of our federal judges? And so therefore, where do we place that type of accountability for a Vice President Harris? And I know, Zakia, you have your hand up, but I think you were going to address something else that I said, but I'm going to let you go, and then Dr. Hardy.
Well, yeah, I just want to jump in here real quick and say that I never want to diminish any of her qualifications by saying that she was gifted in anything. So I just wanted to say that, because we never say that any of these other men were gifted, because if we're talking about gifted, Donald Trump was gifted the presidency. You know what I'm saying? If we wanted to use that language. So I just wanted to jump in and say, we have to also be mindful of the ways in which we discredit Black people, just because we don't think that they are the person that we want to vote for, but we have to be mindful of the ways in which we discredit people who are running for the office of the presidency when we haven't even thrown our hat in the ring, So I just wanted to say that.
No, I know you weren't saying, I know those weren't your words, but those are the words of some people who are refusing to put their support behind Harris. I know that's been out there, but I just wanted to say that. But Dr. Hardy.
So North Carolina is a battleground state. So the Biden-Harris team has been in North Carolina for months and months and months. I've had the opportunity to meet her. I've had the opportunity to meet Biden. It's been awesome. So we get to get up close and personal with this race, because North Carolina is so needed in this election cycle right now. I will tell you that the excitement seems very genuine, very sincere. I have, told the Democrats in North Carolina that the first and foremost thing we needed to do is thank Biden family for its many decades of service to the country. We cannot miss that moment, but that we should be excited about, what happens under President Kamala Harris. I do think that sometimes there's a different standard. There is definitely something to be said for the fact that, everybody's like, oh, insert name of such and such group for Harris or for Kamala. Everybody's super excited right now. And they keep using this language that this is not a moment, it's a movement. And I keep telling people that movements require sustained engagement at a high level in order to become a movement. This will be a movement when on, I don't know, August 29th, September 8th, October 14th, when everybody is still at this level of engagement, this level of giving, this level of all that. But we also have to remember that there are folks who will say they're going to vote for her and then get in the ballot box and they split the ballot. And this happens with Black women candidates all the time. It happened with me. It happened with a whole bunch of Black women down here in North Carolina that I know. And we also have to remember that just as excited as some people are to vote for the first time because they think they're going to get Kamala, there are people who are excited to vote for the first time because they will do absolutely anything necessary to keep her from taking office. So I feel like it's probably almost like a 1-to-1 net. I mean, I know she's up in the polls, but you can't talk to a research professor about polling without having to answer a lot of other questions first. So I don't really care about the polling, the veracity of polling. We are never among the people most frequently polled in these things. And so I don't really care what the polls say, but I can say that it is palpable, the excitement, the enthusiasm, but it is not lost on anyone. And certainly I'm one of the people that says this a lot. Where was all this when she ran the first time? And so I think that she would be outstanding as a president. I think that she's inheriting a historic presidency from Biden. And you talked about the judges. More Black women were placed on the federal bench under Joe Biden than any of his predecessors. And that is something that I believe will continue. I think we'll start to see and I'm with Sister Ali again. I call her name on here multiple times. We don't even know each other. Now we're new best friends. And also Sister Faith, it's like, you guys are amazing. But there is something to be said for having to send her a Congress that is going to help her, because unlike the Republicans, we are not trying to anoint a king or a queen. We are still trying to work with 3 co-equal branches of government. And thus we need to send her congressional folks that are really going to matter. And so one of the concerns I have is that people will be so excited to vote top of ticket that they won't make their way down the rest of the ballot and send her a Congress that is actually going to be supportive of her efforts. And then that leads to the possibility of a presidency, of a term that doesn't look very effective. We know they tried to do this with Barack Obama, that it looks like there's nothing that can get done because the average voter has they're not paying the same level of attention in the same way that most of us on this call on a random Wednesday night, right, or at 8:30 in the evening. Like, they're not paying attention to this in the same way. And so they're going to think, well, we elected her and she got in there, she didn't do anything, without understanding that we didn't give her a Congress, that is absolutely opposed. We gave her a Congress that was opposed to her. So we have to make sure that all of these positions matter. And in fact, I tell folks all the time, the closer your name is to the bottom of the ballot, the closer you are to people's actual concerns. And so we need to make that excitement that we feel for her resonate all the way down the ballot. And so we can put people in place that can actually be beneficial to her term.
Legislator Richburg.
Yeah, I think Sister Favors just brought up a question I was about to say. There was a comment in the chat about that she's not qualified. Vice President Harris is not qualified to be the President of the United States. And I will just say that there's only been one president who has not been a senator, a statewide elected official, or any other elected official, and that was Donald Trump. So I would say that if you're gonna talk about who's not qualified, I would say it is Donald Trump. I will also say there's only one person on the ballot who's led multiple failed businesses and been sued by multiple labor unions, and that is Donald Trump. I'll also say that there is only one person on the ballot who has filed for, 15 bankruptcies. And that is Donald Trump. So if we're going to talk about people who are not qualified, there's only one president who actually ruined an economy in the span of 6 months. and that is Donald Trump. So if we're going to talk about people who are not qualified, let's bring that up. And I will also agree with what Sister Ali said before. We have a habit of ensuring that, and it said, and it actually has happened on this call, Black women or women of color are reluctant to make answers, right? Black men or men in general will just step up and answer, whether we have the answer or not, right? And I think it's important that we do not degrade our sisters, we do not degrade each other, and we make sure we are continually uprising or uplifting. Yes, it is, Joel. Sorry, I'm being a father at the same time. But it is important that we are consistently uplifting our sisters and our brothers to make sure that we are putting ourselves in and them in the right positions of leadership and respect. Because if we don't do that, no one else will. And that is a conversation about whether she is African American or Indian American, or if she's really Black or half Black or whatever, because it is all about degrading who she is as a person. And we cannot let that happen.
Amen. Amen. So let's ask, I'm going to shift again a little bit, and let's ask now, why is DEI now the political term, right, being used to describe those of a particular cultural background? Why is that such in a negative light, right? So can we talk a little bit about how, whether it's with Vice President Harris's background or otherwise, why is DEI receiving such a negative connotation, and why all the attacks on it? Dr. Hardy?
Because it's their new version of reverse racism. It's the new thing that they're allowed to say that says, we remember the young lady who didn't get into like her favorite law school or whatever down in Texas, and she got the moniker Becky with the bad grades. Like, this is the thing that they use. If you are succeeding, then it's at my expense, then I am somehow being unfairly pushed to the side and marginalized. And so everything is now DEI. This is the thing they're allowed to publicly say, because they can't say the thing that they actually want to say, which is actually why they like Donald Trump so much, because he gets to say the things that they can't say to their Black and brown co-workers, that they can't say to their wives. They can't say these things out loud. And so, it's the quintessential example of like the guy who hates his boss, and so he comes home and he kicks his dog, or he yells at his kids because he can't say it out loud and in public. This is the new socially acceptable way to say, I don't like that Black and brown people are getting ahead, and the only plausible explanation is that they must be taking something away from me because my whiteness makes me innately superior to all of them. And so why is it getting a negative connotation? Because it's the new form of reverse racism and whatever other, ism they want to say, affirmative action. It's just their way of saying that your excellence highlights my marginality, my mediocrity, my less thanness, right? And I don't like it. It makes me sad. And so this is the way that they get away with saying that stuff in 2024. That's all it is.
Edu?
Well said, Dr. Hardy. Well said. I mean, those were my exact words verbatim. But when we look at how they describe DEI, it's just another substitute way of saying my privilege no longer offers me the opportunity to get ahead. And that's the reality, right? DEI to them is what Project 2025 is to us. This is our guidelines to helping our communities move forward within a system that is hundreds of years of institutional structural racism that keeps us in the underclass. So instead of saying that my whiteness no longer provides me an opportunity to get me ahead or to stay ahead, they're using the reverse narrative and saying DEI this, DEI that. DEI prevents me from using my whiteness to move forward.
Nakia?
I was just gonna say that it's almost laughable, and I I did catch myself from laughing. But when white people hear DEI, it reminds them of a whole bunch of things. It reminds them of Dred Scott in the United States of America. You have this formerly enslaved man who goes outside of what people traditionally use to argue for their freedom, and he uses the Supreme Court to the point where he makes the Supreme Court turn on its own self and say that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. Y'all passed it, and Dred Scott, this formerly enslaved man, or this enslaved man, turns around and tell y'all that you got to now make your law unconstitutional. How genius is that? This is 1857, so DEI reminds them that it could be a whole bunch more Dred Scotts. We coming up on August the 21st, Nat Turner Rebellion. DEI reminds them of Nat Turner. We coming up on some historical phenomenon that happened in the 1860s and 70s. DEI reminds white people of Reconstruction, that when Black people decide that they want to be in office, and because we had Reconstruction, Black people voted themselves into positions. So we diversified the voting, the ballot, so it's reminding them of Reconstruction. Everything about DEI reminds white people of moments in history when Black people empowered ourselves to do for ourselves, and it wasn't based on their rules. And it also reminds them that in order to be the best, you got to compete against the best, but they ain't never competed against the best, because when you look at Harvard, we know that Harvard has always had a history of enslavement. So somebody like Claudine Gay, she can rise to the ranks, she can become your president, but then y'all make it so hard on her to the point where she got to resign. I probably would have taken a different approach, but her approach was to resign. So every time they see somebody able to shatter this glass ceiling that they created, DEI reminds them of that, and they don't know what to do. So they start trembling in their boots like holy water just got sprinkled on top of them. So they don't know what the move is, because all of these moves, from Nat Turner to Dred Scott to Claudine Gay, these have all been chess moves, and they are not very good chess players, or at least at this point, their skill set is regressing. So that's why they don't like DEI, because they don't want a diverse world, because it shatters this notion and idea of what Adolf Hitler was saying, that there's a superior race. Well, when Jesse Owens got out there in front of you, that myth was shattered right in front of your eyeballs. So what you gonna do about that? So DEI, it shatters everything that they hold on to, and it questions or it challenges their idea of cognitive dissonance. And now they have to come to grips with it.
So we touched on some of these issues during your conversations, but I'm going to ask this question just outright. So if, and maybe when, Vice President Harris wins the presidency, what do you think will be some of her biggest obstacles to overcome, not only nationally, but also internationally?
I think, I'm sorry, I didn't raise my hand, Kevin. I apologize.
Okay, go ahead, Dr. Hardy. You jumped in first. This is like Family Feud. You buzzed in first.
So if I'm going from the outside in, thinking about the global space, and somebody just actually put part of it in here now, the support of Israel, the silence on the Congo and the Sudan. I think on some level it's having to inherit, because at the same time that she's inheriting record low unemployment and all of these things, like there's all these positive things that the Biden-Harris team jointly have pushed and been successful at. She's also inheriting the negative things as well, and I think that's. But I think that's every president. Biden inherited, having to deal with the COVID crisis, and, thank God for that. So we didn't lose another million people, but meaning thank God for how he handled that. So everybody's got to inherit something. Barack had to inherit this, economic collapse in society. But I don't know. I don't think that it's going to be a diplomacy issue for her. I really don't. I think she's actually going to handle those things very well. And I think it's actually going to make the United States look a lot better if we do get her into office, such that they might see a partner that they may not have seen in predecessors, including Joe Biden. I think they will see someone who is also willing to push. You have to be willing to push the status quo to get into this space, in this moment, and in this space and in this skin that she's in, right? And so you have to be willing to push back and be different. And I think that there's a way in which she will address these international issues that is unlike and maybe even more effective than her predecessors. And I think the global space will be open to the receipt of that, because it'll look like, wow, maybe America is becoming a bit more progressive, is changing a little bit. Internally, harkening back to what we've said before, if we do not send her a federal legislature that is actually going to be supportive of her efforts, that's going to be a real challenge. That's going to be a real challenge. So that is a problem. And then someone just put something in the chat that says like she doesn't have like a policy agenda or something. I would argue that her policy agenda is probably mostly in alignment with what she's been under for the last 3.5 years as the vice president, and we've not given her very much time to come up with something that's sort of bespoke to her. But I think we can see that she's going to do an excellent job on trying to codify Roe v. Wade back into law nationally and make sure that women's rights are protected for real. I don't know. I think that the thing I'm most concerned about really is if we do not send her a legislature that is actually going to do the work. I'm actually hopeful that Biden will do something about Supreme Court reform prior to his exit, so that she can have a court system that won't undermine her, even if she does have a legislature that's willing to be supportive. I don't think that the global issue will be as, I don't know, I have to process more about the global piece, but I do think that there's a point at which she will have to attend to these issues. But I think that her style of engagement has been such that that'll be globally well received. I think I talked all over the place there. I'm sorry. I defer to my colleague.
That's quite all right. I'm sure Dr. Sharp will be able to address the global issue when he gets his opportunity. But right now we're going to go to Zakiya, then Dr. Sharp, and then Edu.
I think the greatest obstacle that she's going to have to confront is her gender. We have had on the international global scene, we've had women who were heads of state. So we had on the continent of Africa, we had Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. We had it in Malawi. We have it in Tanzania. But for whatever reason, those women did not get the international acclaim or the I guess they weren't seen as being capable as somebody like Angela Merkel or somebody like a Margaret Thatcher. And a lot of it might have to do with, I think a lot of it definitely has to do with gender, but it also has to do with race. So I think that for one, Kamala Harris is going to have to deal with people's internal and implicit and explicit bias around how they see women being able to lead in the world, especially when it comes down to how is she going to fare with people in the Middle East, with male leadership in the Middle East. What is that going to look like for her? And in the United States of America, I think there are a couple of things that Kamala Harris is going to have to deal with. And of course, it's going to be racism, because that's never going to go anywhere in the United States of America. Of course, it's going to be her gender, but it's also going to be her authenticity. And if you really are in the office to make the changes that you say that you want to change and to make America the best America that you want to be, then I think that she's going to have to step out of the line with the status quo and become the leader that she really has to be in her authentic self, so that America can move forward under her watch and not her performing the presidency as somebody else and they're not even inside of the seat. So those are the things that I think that she will have to work on, gender, and that's out of her control, but authenticity is something she can definitely control.
Dr. Sharp?
Yes, I'll just add to that. I think that on the foreign policy level, actually she's coming with quite a bit of experience, actually. And she's coming with a very seasoned team. Probably other than Biden, there's been no president as seasoned as her, actually, probably since Bush won. So that's on the positive. What I fear is that she will be blamed for America's diminished role in the world. Right when Trump actually changed, well, definitely diminished America's star in the world. And I think that she may be blamed for things that are really outside of her control. Her blackness, her Asianness, her femaleness, all of that might be blamed. For example, China's presence in Africa, right? China's presence in the Caribbean, Russia's presence in Africa and the Caribbean. How will she deal with Iran, for example? Something we haven't mentioned. And so, and I'm afraid that they'll do the same thing that they said to Biden. Well, oh, he's weak, when it's a much more complicated issue than maybe most Americans are willing to digest. So I'll stop there, but I'm hopeful.
Edu?
I think everyone in this panel has made great points in regards to the fears or concerns and how she would be viewed globally. But I want to just keep in mind what Legislator Richburg stated earlier in the program about the Messiah effect. And I just want to remind folks that we do have to give her some time to deal with the spotlight being on her as opposed to her as vice president. Now the light is on you. And every president that I know has had to deal with the Middle East issue. How Israel is dealing with its neighbors, how its neighbors is dealing with Israel. How does she deal with that, especially internally with organizations such as AIPAC, and how they try to influence or how they try to help her broker peace in the Middle East, right? Those are the issues that she's going to face. Another growing issue, which Dr. Sharp stated earlier, how is she going to deal with U.S. place in the world as a global leader in regards to military? How do you deal with China? How do you deal with Russia? How do you deal with Ukraine? Those are the issues that she's going to face, and now the spotlight is on her. And does she have the team that's going to be in her administration to help her deal with those international and foreign relations? And to make sure that we do have, hopefully, if we have control of the House, if we still have control of the Senate, will we be able to make sure that America stand as the global power that it is, but also to deal with the foreign issues that we're constantly dealing with, and how we're viewed in the eyes of Russia, who's also always a constant threat, how China is going to be dealing with us, and how do we compete with China in the global economy. Those are the issues that she's going to be faced with because the other presidents have faced. Biden's dealing with that right now. How do we deal with Africa? How do we deal with the China's expansion in Africa? How we deal with bringing Africa up to the forefront? How do we bring the Caribbean up to the forefront? Those are going to be her allies. How do we bring them up to the forefront and prosper economically? So those are issues that I do have some concerns that she'll be faced with, and how she'll be able to deal with the allies in government.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for all of your wonderful insight and your comments. And as we begin to wrap up, I want you all just to think about this, because I'm going to come to each of you for about a 30-second response, if you can condense it into that amount of time. I want your response to what the importance is of, again, not telling everybody who to vote for, because that's not what we're here for, but just reminding everyone the importance of identifying misinformation and disinformation in making your decisions on all the things that we discussed this evening. And I'll go around with, as soon as people put their hands up, we can start to identify. But why is it so important that we identify misinformation and disinformation when it comes to Project 2025, the Kamala Harris effect, and anything else that's associated with the election cycle going on? Dr. Hardy?
I mean, I struggled with trying to come up with an answer because it feels obvious, right? But it really, I don't know that it is. If these things were obvious, we wouldn't have to ask these questions. I think the reason is because it's worse than people realize. What's at stake is worse than people realize. Some of us knew about Project 2025 before it caught fire in the media. And so and I would just tell people, folks, like, this, y'all don't understand, like, it's worse than you know, like, this is going to get really, really bad. And I think they expect people who are in political spaces to say things like that, to sort of, gin up their support for, going out and voting and things like that. But I think it's important to recognize misinformation, lies, to root out lies. Because you deserve to be an informed voter. You deserve to really know what's at stake, and people who can lie to you and manipulate you into thinking that everything's going to be just fine and all that sort of stuff, they will, because if that's what they're having to do, that means they don't have any policy perspective that is going to be beneficial to you at all, and they know that. They know that what they really believe, if they really told you what they really believe, you wouldn't vote for them. So it's important to identify this and to call it out, because you deserve to know exactly who it is that you're actually voting for. And because you need to make a very well-informed decision. There are millions of registered voters, especially Black folk, who don't see the ballot box as a tool in the arsenal against tyranny anymore. They don't see it as a tool in their arsenal to combat economic oppression, social oppression, and injustice. They don't see it. They've given up on the process right now. But this is the moment where it really is worse than they realize. And so it's really important for them to know what's true and what's not, so they can make an informed decision.
Thank you. Dr. Sharp?
Yes, as someone like many of us who's in the classroom, quite a bit, dealing with young people. One thing, misinformation, as I said in the beginning, I think this is a critical issue when it comes to everything, but to our elections for sure. So I would, and this is really targeted to our youth. Don't rely only on social media for your information. Listen to opposing views, right? And very important, there's a concept that we have: triangulate your information. So if you're getting your information only from social media, try something else. For example, some people have an idea of what mainstream news is. Well, do you know what it is if you haven't read it, right? So I also think that reading is very, very important. It's something that we're losing. So read, triangulate your information, listen to opposing views. Let's say we have a liberal perspective. It is fascinating to listen to a conservative perspective. It makes our perspective stronger, right? Because we know the arguments. I know that seems very basic, but that's from teacher to teacher. From I guess I'm saying, but I think misinformation, social media. When I hear from students, where do you get your news? Oh, only from TikTok. I mean, I hear the alarm bell in my mind, going off. So I think this is really, really important. Thanks.
Yeah, that's using TikTok for your news is like going to Wikipedia for your research. But Legislator Richburg?
I think part of the conversation when we talk about getting your news from social media is change your algorithm, right? So getting your information from TikTok isn't bad if you're reading the New York Times, or you're getting the U.S. News and World Report, or you're looking at Black Enterprise, or what have you, right? And I'm gonna say Black Enterprise one more time, right? But if you're searching, different dances, if you're searching different celebrities, if you're searching different the type of news that you get. And so what Dr. Sharp was saying just now about making sure that you get your news from other places, that goes with your search bar as well, because that's how you change your algorithm. That's how you change the news that comes to you. I would add one more part to that. When you talk about talking to people in your echo chamber, because when you talk to people in your echo chamber, you're getting the same thing that you're already hearing. And you need to talk to people from opposing views. I sit at the legislature, and I'm the minority leader of the Suffolk County Legislature. And so, but one of the person who sits to my right is a conservative, and we have conversations all the time. We don't know. We definitely don't always agree, but we talk through the idea. And I do the same thing with the folks on the other side, with the rest of the folks on the other side of the aisle, because there might be a perspective that I'm missing. But I think understanding why something has happened is so important. I had this conversation with my goddaughter last week, and she was talking to me about her perspective on the Olympics and why certain countries shouldn't get medals. And I said, well, what do you know about those countries? Well, I know what I got from TikTok and Google. And I said, well, what websites did you go to? And so she got a little mad at me, and she's probably watching now. So hi, Sarai. But I think what I said to her is, you have to find out why we got to this point. And so she went back to 1967 and this and that. And I said, no. Go back to the 1900s, the 1800s, the Treaty of Westphalia, right? All of those things that brought us to the modern conversation about geopolitical conversations. We are so quick to, let's say, 1980s was so long ago, but unfortunately that was like yesterday when you talk about geopolitics and national politics. And so understanding why we got to this point, whether it's talking about W.E.B. Du Bois or, you know, the war of Carthage coming into Italy. All of those things were so important to how we got to where we are to today. But if you don't understand that, that's why education is important. You're not going to understand why we are where we are today. Thank you.
Zakia?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that it's been a pleasure being on this panel. So thank you, Earl, my son, Spring 96, for inviting me to be on this panel of a fantastic man of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. I'm really thankful to be up here and to, express ideas and exchange ideas with everybody that's on this panel. I think y'all are all phenomenal, just the bomb. That's all I can say on that. When I think about this question, I'm just immediately taken to the space of, I'm an HBCU graduate. I went to Virginia State University. I'm currently at Howard University. And at HBCU, when it's homecoming time, the band will play Stop, Look, and Listen. We are the mighty Trojans. So the words that come to mind for me is stop, look, and listen. And when I say stop, I really mean just become introspective. Think about exactly what's happening in this moment, in this time, and learn how to, just meditate on what is going on around us. Look, I'm really talking about reading. Go into the arsenals, go into the archives, look at how the Crisis magazine, especially when it was under the leadership of W.B. Du Bois, look at how the Crisis was writing about news and information that was happening inside of the community. Look at how spaces like the Atlanta Black Star is writing about information. So use the journals, go into these spaces and read what the Nation of Islam was writing inside of the column of the Pittsburgh, of the Pittsburgh Courier, and go to newspaper.com and see how these issues were written about in the past. So that's the first thing. So reading is fundamental. My professor always used to say it, but we do have to definitely read more, because the more things change, the more things stay the same. And I think that it is imperative that we all learn to listen. We have 2 ears and we have 1 mouth for a reason. And as I'm sitting up here thinking about all of these things, one name comes to mind. And I just want to put his name inside of this atmosphere because he was a powerful ancestor. And I think that I would be remiss if I didn't bring him into this conversation. So on August the 13th, it was the anniversary, or the day that commemorated the day that he was shot down and he was killed at 10 o'clock a.m. in South Carolina on the courthouse, in Mississippi on the courthouse steps. He was killed 15 days before Emmett Till was killed. In the same year, on July 13th, 1955, and I'm talking about Lamar Smith. Lamar Smith was a World War I veteran. He was a Black farmer, but he also was a voting activist. And his job, when he came back into his community to empower Black people in Mississippi, what he decided to do is to get people to fill in absentee ballots for a special runoff election that was about to happen in Mississippi. So everybody can go look him up, look up his story. Again, his name is Lamar, and everybody know Lamar Smith. So Lamar Smith was a martyr. He died as a martyr for his people because he stopped, he looked around, and he was listening to what was necessary for the people in Mississippi at the time. 15 days After he was shot down in 1955, we know Emmett Till, a 14-year-old, was killed in Mississippi. So imagine what it must have meant for those people in Mississippi to know that you now have to deal with two extremely high-profile assassinations that have happened in your state. What does it mean for them to want to go out there and vote? What does it mean for them to want to be empowered? What does it mean for them to galvanize themselves? And we're talking about two cities in Mississippi that's only about 3 hours apart from one another. So stop, look, and listen. Read the stories, go to the narratives. I'm also, the last person that I'm gonna put out here is Ophelia Settle Egypt. She was the first person to actually record the oral histories of African-American people who were the last living generation of the institution of enslavement. We always give Franklin D. Roosevelt the credit for that, but this is my sorority sister, Ophelia Settle Egypt. She was a sociologist. She was the person who first collected those narratives so that the people who actually endured the institution of enslavement told us in their words that this is what happened to me on the government's watch. And then Franklin D. Roosevelt activated the Federal Writers Project, and they started collecting the stories 10 to 15 years later. But it's so important for us to dig back into the archives of our history so that we can speak from a place of empowerment and not speak from a place of short-lived historical experiences. And on that note, I had a great time with everybody.
Thank you. We always welcome you to come in and drop all your pearls of wisdom on us. Edu, and then Lori, you'll have the last word.
I'll defer to Lori.
Sorry about that. Brothers, respectfully, I want to first just say thank you so much to all of you who have spoken. I am honored to have participated in this event, but I would be remiss if I did not correct you. It's Lurie, like Marie with an L. I just couldn't let it go.
You let me go 2 hours mispronouncing your name.
It was more important to get the information out, but since this is the final comments, I figured I was slipping in because my mama's probably watching this, and if I don't do it, I'm gonna hear about it for the next 2 weeks. But I wanted to say, in addition to all of the powerful words that were just shared, there is also the fact that internationally, race in America has always been a tool to cause exacerbated divisions for the purposes of serving international designs. We know from a variety of reports and investigations, the 2016 election was where we saw Russia show up in Facebook ads in significant ways. Over half of their expenditures in social media in the lead up to the 2016 campaign was in social media digital advertisement, and they mentioned race. So when we're talking about online information, when we're talking about what it means to look at misinformation and disinformation, we know that it is in the best interest of other people that we do not participate in elections. Now, we can feel what we feel about candidates, but once again, I will remind you that all the vote is hiring the people who are going to make the resource allocation decisions for our communities. Now, if you are comfortable with the idea that white supremacists, white Christian nationalists, and people who cannot stand our Black behind are going to be the ones going to the polls and making the decision and hiring the people who will make the resource allocations. And if you think we have the ability to engage in enough mutual aid and community uplift to overcome that, then I invite you to welcome us to Wakanda, because I ain't seen it yet. So I encourage us to be crystal clear. When we're talking about misinformation and disinformation, we have to ask real important questions. It cannot be that we have one standard for one candidate that we don't apply to the other. I saw in the chat a comment or two that indicated we don't know what her policy is. And we certainly may say that there has not been a policy platform issued, but misinformation and disinformation thinking would have us stop at that inquiry, as opposed to saying, well, do we also know what his policy proposals are? And if you can tell me what his policy proposals are, I got a bridge from Brooklyn to Jersey to sell you, and I'm guaranteeing you ain't going to be able to do it. So we have to be equitable in how we are making the inquiry. That's one way that we can be on guard against the impact of misinformation and disinformation. And what we can also say is, well, what Africans have done, Africans can do, as we are taught by Marcus Garvey. That's one of his most powerful quotes. And if that's true, then that is an indicator that we should take a Sankofa approach. We can look at what both of the candidates, who are either of whom is going to be president, and we can say, what have they done? We may not have a clear understanding of what they're going to do in the future, but let's look at the history upon which they are building. You have one that was practically homicidally psychotic in the administration of one of the most devastating pandemics that our world has known in the common era. destroyed the economy, and that's where you even take out the COVID dollars and come do a comparison, absolutely devastated the economy, was a piss poor leader that stoked anger and frustration and gave cover for the explicit demonstration of white supremacist behaviors that previously had been kept quiet and at home. And we know that that is the history. And we can also look at her history and we can ask ourselves, what has she done? Our dear brother Meek Mill got on got on Elon Musk's Twitter and asked a question that he said he wanted to know. He had heard rumors about Kamala Harris, and he wanted to know what was her history in the district attorney's office. And he posed it as if it was a question that did not have a knowable answer. That is an effort that is unfortunately demonstrating the impact of misinformation and disinformation thinking. It's not just being aware of the memes that you're taking in, it's being aware of how you're thinking about the content that is being produced. And so we would have to say to a brother like Meek Mills, these are knowable things. She has been on the record talking extensively about this. A simple Google search will be able to provide you that information. So we have to ask questions that are designed to be informative, not contrarian. There's a lot of joy out of contrarian activity and engagement that is unfortunately really good for likes and Twitter views. It's extraordinarily bad for ensuring that the needs of our community gets met. And I am not tied to any particular political party. I am tied to the liberation of Black people. And if that means that while we are in this space, we have to exercise government and engagement civically, in addition to doing the mutual aid, in addition to doing the Black liberation, education, and theology, in addition to doing the spirit work, we have to also engage with government, because I have yet to meet a Black-led organization that can provide clean water, that can provide independent education, that can provide healthcare. So while we are in this place, some of which, is empire in and of itself, let us be clear that we must be sophisticated about how we engage with this government, and we are making up for a 346-year gap in our ability to get to engage with the body politic. And I know I'm taking long, but I just want to say this because I don't want to act like I'm blaming Black people. But from 1619 until 1964, we could be killed for having this conversation. We had to sneak out into the woods to try to figure out how to get our babies free. And so while our white counterparts were thinking about how do you create political clubs? How do you organize and fundraise? What does it mean to build not just a candidate, but a bench of candidates that's got depth? What does it mean to sit in a room and organize 120 organizations to come together and create a 920-page plan called Project 2025 that will completely revolutionize government in a way that is in the subservience of our interests? Those were things we did not get the experiential knowledge to engage in because we could be killed for having this discussion. So it's not our fault that we do not know how to engage in a sophisticated manner when it comes to civics engagement. And it's not our fault that we're led by emotion. It makes sense considering the history. But if we are going to survive the return of white supremacy, because right now, if I am correct in my belief that we are witnessing the intentional deconstruction of reconstruction, of integration 2.0, which is exactly what happened at the end of the Civil War. We had that brief 10 to 12-year period of reconstruction where Black people were doing things, engaging civically like never before, and then white nationalist terrorism ended it. And we were in Jim Crow for damn near 100 years later. And if we want to avoid that, it is going to be imperative that we engage in a more sophisticated level of discourse and demand more of ourselves and of our celebrities and of people who say that they are speaking on behalf of Black people, because Black people deserve a government that is not going to be in opposition to us on everything. We deserve a government that we are able to engage with, that we can use to marshal the resources and representation that we deserve and which our communities need to thrive.
Edu, do you want to follow that, or are we good?
Usually I wouldn't, but I was hoping that she would be done by 9/11.
No, in true fashion, she was done by 9/13, right?
I love it. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the brothers of Brooklyn, Long Island Alumni Chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated for having this discussion in regards to Project 2025. And in answer to your question, how we make sure that the voter get let me find the right words, the right information to make an educated choice in regards to who to support for president. I always talk about the short term and the long term. In regards to short term, we want to make sure that we can diversify the information that we're receiving. I used to think that the New York Times was the ultimate decision maker for me, but as the times go by, I start to realize how the New York Times is just as biased as any other newspaper. I always make an emphasis as it relates to information, especially the information I receive or the information that my children receive, or the information that my students receive, is to make sure you get it from different perspectives. I'm big on supporting Black public media in particularly. You want to listen to those panelists that discuss about these issues because they've been talking about it for a very long time. The long term, and this is why Project 2025 has stayed so much in regards to making dramatic changes in regards to defunding Department of Education initiatives. They want to remove and replace the history of the dramatic effects of slavery on the Black people, on the African diaspora, internationally and domestically. We have to make sure that we make the right decision come the election time to make sure that we can tell our history. We can keep the information in our public schools. The last couple of years, the New York City Council funded allocated resources for Black Studies program in our New York City public schools. That has been a tremendous help for our kids. Just understand the why on why things are happening. That's the long-term approach. For the short-term approach, you need to diversify the information that you're receiving. And that's why I support Black media. And I think avenues such as the Real Talk is important for our young people to actually listen to us, listen to the different perspectives that we're presenting to them so they can make an educated choice. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been an honor to work with all of you panelists. You are all brilliant, and I'm honored. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And before we
Thank
do
you so
close
much.
out, I do want to bring on the poll mark or president of the Brooklyn Long Island Alumni Chapter, newly elected poll mark of the Brooklyn Long Island Alumni Chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi, Brother Mario King, to say a few words.
Good evening. Good evening. What an awesome session this has been for not only for ourselves, but also for our community. On behalf of the Brooklyn Long Island Alumni Chapter, we want to thank you. And we want to thank our own brother Boston Hill for moderating this awesome session, the panelists for joining and sharing insightful information and empowering us as a community to make informed decisions ahead of this election. We thank you as the viewers and encourage you to follow us on our socials and YouTube to hear more about the exciting topics in our future Real Talk series aimed at empowering our community as well. Until then, we encourage you to stay informed and stay active. And thank you.
Well, that's all the time that we do have for tonight. We would like to thank our panelists, Dr. Michael Sharp, Laree Daniel Favors, Legislator Jason Richburg, Dr. Kimberly Hardy, Edru Hermelin, Zakia Ali for lending us your expertise for this conversation. We would also like to thank you all, our viewers, for tuning in to this latest installment of the Cast Your Vote Real Talk series, Project 2025 and the Kamala Harris Effect, sponsored by the Brooklyn Long Island Alumni Chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. And a big thank you to Brother Earl Fleary for making all of this happen. My name is Kevin Boston Hill, and it was a pleasure serving as your moderator for this evening. Please, everyone, have a safe evening.
Thank you.